Can you guys hear me?
Hello.
Hello, hello. Thank you for joining. What an intense season we find ourselves in. And I'm very grateful to you for this hour. Let me frame the hour by saying, I think there is just a lot of intensity around Israel, more than any that I can remember in my lifetime. Last night, I heard a presentation by Rachel Fish, who was speaking to the board of Combined Jewish Philanthropies. And she, as you may know, she heads up the foundation that the Kraft family created to deal with anti-Semitism and then, in the wake of George Floyd's murder, hate in general. And she was speaking to the CJP people. Basically, what I took away from it was things have never been more dire for people who support Israel's existence. Here's what she said, and then we have to talk about how we deal with this internally and also deal with it with our own souls and then with our own loved ones and our own relationships broadening out. According to Rachel, it's now basically an unacceptable position on college campuses to support the state of Israel. And she said that, like in the UC system, the University of California system, that if you are an avowed supporter of Israel and you support Israel's right to exist and you talk about Yom HaAtzmaut, as a good day, you will not get tenure. That is something that you will not get tenure if you're pro-Israel and support Israel in the UC system. Then she said, and she said that next point is that the animus against Israel is so thick. 2 points are worth noting. The basic mantra is free Palestine, free Palestine. And what free Palestine means is from river to the sea. In other words, what free Palestine means is that, we could argue amongst ourselves about settlements and 67 and settlement creep and annexation and, the neighborhood in East Jerusalem. And that's a nice Newton internal conversation. That's not where the conversation is had on social media, and that's not where the conversation is had on college campuses. Free Palestine means no Israel, and that no Israel is the official moral position, that Israel is an anachronism, that it's colonial, that, what are Jews doing in that land? And that this is college campuses, and she lives here, this is her work, that what you do is you graft upon Israel the whole colonialism, white people oppressing people of color motif. And what you come up with is Israel has no right to exist. And that Hamas and terrorism are simply not categories that have any resonance on college campuses. When you say, but we got out in 2005, that is just of no consequence. When you say, but Hamas has launched thousands of missiles, that's of no consequence. So it was, right? So free Palestine means no Jewish state from the river to the sea. And then she said as follows that, and she's had conversations with Jewish kids. We raise our kids to have good progressive values, to be supportive of LGBTQ+, to care about climate and climate control, to be supportive of communities of color and civil rights, and to be against mass incarceration. And what she says, Rachel says, happens in community after community, and she's talked to our college kids, is let's say you're a pro-Israel supporter of climate, of the science of climate change, and you want to do, be environmental stewards. You have to choose Israel or the environment. You have to choose Israel or LGBTQ. You have to choose civil rights or Israel. And you cannot be an out supporter of Israel and these progressive causes. And kid after kid is faced with this reckoning. And there is an intense bullying of people who support Israel's right to exist on college campuses and among faculty. And this is true because Princeton, which is on the East Coast, had this march against Jewish supremacy, and it was signed by many, many, many faculty advisors. So, and then her final point. So it's unprecedented. You can't get tenure if you're out. It's socially unacceptable to be pro-Israel, and that the kind of conversations we have at Hartman and here at Temple Emmanuel about shrink the conflict and what can we do about it. So that's not the conversation that is happening on social media. The conversation on social media is free Palestine, and that the smart money in terms of moral thinking on college campuses, the people who teach your kids and grandkids on college campuses, is free Palestine. There's no Israel. So to be honest with you, when I was done with this talk that she gave to the CJP leadership, I mean, I was just eavesdropping because Shira was listening and I was listening to it. It just scared the shit out of me. I'm just being straight up with you. It scared the shit out of me. Okay. And I think so that's the real world. So what I want to, so I think, and I'll just tell you one other thing that is also scary to me. I've been meeting, when I sent that, when I took my position against the rabbinical students, I pissed off a lot of people, and I've been trying to meet with every person one-on-one. I'm still behind on that, but I'm trying to meet with every person one-on-one. And one person who, longtime member, who dismisses Israel as a racist country, our member, when I was meeting with him, and I said to this person, good moral person, but who has kind of washed his hands of Israel, I said, but we got out of Gaza. We gave Gaza to the Palestinians in Gaza. And he said that is just fighting yesterday's war that does not matter. So I guess what here is the project that I think all this eventuates in. And these are the only moves that I have, which are strengthening the center and redoubling education and redoubling reasonable conversations with people who disagree with us, one person at a time. So let me take those again. One is strengthening the center. So I'm going to be just, again, I don't have any, the time is urgent and I have no bullshit in my system. So I'm just going to be straight out with you. One response to hearing all this is to run into the arms of Donald Trump and the right, because evangelicals love Israel, at least older evangelicals love Israel. And so you could say, you know what, for all of you, tweets too much, but Trump, okay? I think that would be, for me personally, that would be a bad mistake. To go from extreme to extreme, to go from woke Kool-Aid to Trump Kool-Aid, very problematic. What we need to do, and I think Temple Emmanuel is the space to do it, is to strengthen the center. Trump Kool-Aid, bad. Woke Kool-Aid, bad. Strengthen the center. Next point is education. So one of the things that I think, and I've been talking to my colleagues about it, and I've been talking to Shira about it, and Shira's talking to Mark Baker about it, and Brad, this was in Brad Artson's piece, and Sharon Konanisfeld and I were talking about this. This rising generation, like the rabbinical students who wrote this, and this was in Brad's piece if you read it, they don't know Israeli history. They don't know Israeli history. They don't know the many times Israel has tried and taken real risks for peace. So we actually need to teach, and that feels like a distinctively Jewish move, is to teach Israeli history, warts and all. You know, I'm not a fan of annexation creep at all, and of settlement creep at all. And I think the settlement move has been nefarious morally and practically. But you're smoking hashish or you're drinking from woke Kool-Aid if you think the issue is settlements. The issue is not settlements. The issue is Israel's existence. So we need to do Israel education and teach our kids the complexities of Israel. And then the final piece that I think we need to work on is the hardest piece, which is slow in-person conversations, one person at a time. And she was specifically asked, and I was asked, I was teaching our kids last week, when your kids go off to Oberlin, or when your kids go off to Oberlin or UCLA or Tufts or wherever they go, and there's going to be an anti-Israel rally, which there will be, and there's going to be, you know, social media, which is aflame with anti-Israel feeling, which there will be. My instinct, and fortunately Rachel Fish said the same thing, is to tell our kids not to engage that. When you know, people say, as they do, I shared this last week, David and Lauren Mammon's son-in-law, Zach Weinreich, is at MIT Business School, and MIT circulated a petition claiming that Israel is guilty of, I just want to get all of this, ethnic cleansing, genocide, and war crimes. And this was signed by 500 MIT students and faculty. This was last week, 2 weeks ago. 500. Israel is guilty of ethnic cleansing, genocide, and war crimes. I mean, I was saying that to Shira, this is extremely terrifying, because it's like, if you've read Elie Wiesel, and I've read a lot of Elie Wiesel talks a lot about madness, that madness descended in the 30s, and madness descended in the 40s. And when MIT students, including plenty of Jews, talk about ethnic cleansing, and they signed that petition, that is madness. Whatever you want to say about the settlements, it wasn't wise, it wasn't, that's not ethnic cleansing. Genocide, it's not genocide. War crimes, they're actually the ones doing what war crimes? I mean, they're sending missiles on our civilians. And when smart kids, engineers at MIT, including Jewish engineers at MIT, are saying ethnic cleansing, genocide, and war crimes, I'm thinking Elie Wiesel 30s madness. If you read his parables, if you read Ariel Berger's book called Witness, about the parables and the teaching of Elie Wiesel, a lot of his teaching is about madness descending. Madness, like reason flees, and what you have is madness. And I feel like we are living in that zone now, when Jewish kids and smart kids and professors at MIT and professors at Princeton, and you know, are that Israel is an apartheid state and does not have the right to exist. So this is not, do I love Bibi? I don't love Bibi. This is not, as every policy of the Israeli government appropriate. It's not. But no. Where the conversation is that the progressive edge is saying Israel does not have a right to exist. It's guilty of ethnic cleansing, genocide, and war crimes. If you think I'm making it up, call Zach Weinreich. He saw the petition, his friend signed it. That's where the world is. So I think what we need to do is strengthen the center, education, and one-on-one conversations. That is my very somber opening gambit. My very somber opening gambit. And then what I want to also do is introduce another very challenging complexity, which is very often our kids, because they're growing up in this intersectional world, and our kids, because they're going to these campuses where you're literally bullied and canceled if you support Israel. You know, it's like Stockholm syndrome. You start to believe your captor. So what I want to do is actually share an article with you in the foreword that was, Shira Telushkin, who is Rabbi Joseph Telushkin's daughter, who's a good friend of my son. We've had her for Pesach dinner many times. She does kind of like an Ann Landers for the foreword. And I'm going to ask Caitlin, who is kind enough to be our Zoom master, to just share the opening of that letter. And then I want to invite some conversation from everybody who's on the screen who has something to share. So if you can just, so I'm going to just read this, and we're not going to read her answer yet. I just want to read the question. And then I want to invite some conversations around this, okay? Dear Bintel, this is like the Ann Landers of the forward. My father is a kind and very loving man who I respect deeply. He's also just fun and cool. I often borrow his clothes. We watch movies together all the time. All my friends love him. My whole family in general has a genuinely close relationship, and I feel very lucky. We're really on the same page about most things. But oh my God, mention Israel, and I feel like everything goes right off the rails. My father, who is generally a normal, liberal, cares about people kind of guy, goes into a very hard place whenever you mention politicians he decides are anti-Israel. There's no redeeming them. Anything that suggests being anti-Israel is immediately seen as very bad. Our conversations about this are never really angry. He will listen to what I have to say, or at least not interrupt me, but then he throws 1,000 questions at me that sound like far-right talking points. I'll talk about something terrible happening with Palestinian villages, and he'll ask if I care about women being oppressed in Saudi Arabia, or that Hamas is anti-gay, as if that has anything to do with anything. As you might imagine, our conversations about this last series of attacks have gone nowhere. I genuinely do not know what to do. I told him I don't know if I can identify as Zionist, and he said some nasty things. My mother told me he'd been heartbroken about it. Well, I'm heartbroken about what many self-identifying Zionists have been saying in recent weeks. I have two sisters who are 12 and 14 years older than me, and they mostly agree with me, but say it is easier to just not talk about it with my dad. Is that what I should do? His birthday is next weekend, and I feel like I need to address it before then. I can't imagine writing a card without this being discussed. What can I do? Signed, no peace. So Caitlin, if you can, okay. So now what I want to do is, if you have anything to say, I want to ask if that kind of dialogue of any kind resonates within your family or within your lived experience. And if it does, I'd like to hear about it. And I'd like to hear about your thoughts, what you would say to this daughter, or what you would say to people with whom you have had this kind of experience. And then we'll talk about what she has to say as well. So you raise your hand or put your question in the chat, and I'd love to get lots of voices. Because I think this Ann Landers piece kind of concretizes the disturbing trends that Rachel Fish talked about that are alive on every college campus, except perhaps for Falwell University. Cyril Mazansky, and if you can unmute.
Wes, you know where I stand regarding my absolute and unquestionable love of Israel, where my Zionism, as I always tell you, is part of my DNA. I've also told you about this very good friend of mine from high school, who made Aliyah as soon as he graduated from high school, and who has had an extremely prestigious career as a professor of international law at Hebrew University, who also is a very liberal person, and where he stands with the current situation. So he made Aliyah in the Ben Gurion days of labor and altruism. He's fought in 3 wars, and he lives the reality now. And in my conversations with him, he brings up all the time how Israel is wrong today. Israel is bad today. What Israel is doing is not good. And just yesterday, and with his permission, I must first ask him if I can forward to you the long letter he wrote to me about the current situation. But something you have not brought up, because I also sent him Daniel's Hartman's and Danny Gordis's letters, and asked him what he thought of them. And he raises the important point: nobody brings up what causes this war. Why does this happen? And I just, from his long email yesterday, I took out 2 comments that he said. He said in his contact with the former head of Israeli security services, this man describes Gaza as the biggest prison on earth. And then he goes on to describe the horrendous existence of the average citizen in Gaza. He then makes another very pertinent point. He says, unless there is peace, the society is threatened. So what he is saying is, in fact, that the current track which Israel is pursuing is doomed to ultimate failure. We don't need the college kids to cancel Israel. Israel may be on the path to canceling itself. And it is a discussion that we need to have as well, particularly you who've spent the past year bringing up the issues of racial injustice in this country and what we can do to improve it.
So Cyril, I agree with every syllable you said. And I think some really important things follow from it. Okay, first of all, I think, and one of the reasons I sent you Daniel Hartman's piece is he talks about not only the legitimacy, but the necessity of reasonable moral critiques of Israel. I mean, that's Daniel, right? So a reasonable moral critique of Israel is not ethnic cleansing or genocide or war crimes. That's just a blood libel. But a reasonable critique, I'm down for that. I mean, I think that's is a fine thing to have and to do. But here is what I would say to this gentleman, and I think having that conversation with your kids or with your friends or with your neighbors or with your friend from Israel is a great thing to do. But I would just give you one thing to give back to this gentleman, okay? The New York Times Daily last week ran a piece last Wednesday or Thursday called Hamas, why does it keep bombing Israel? Why does it keep fighting and losing? Okay, and the New York Times is no fan of Israel, especially during this war. I mean, they kept the war along, open and alive, for even when the ceasefire was there. I mean, last week they had the portraits of the children, etc. So Israel, the New York Times is no fan of Israel. And when I saw this daily podcast on Hamas, I thought, oh my God, I'm never going to survive this. But I listened to it. I forced myself to listen to it, and I'm glad I did, because what the podcast says, the New York Times, no fan of Israel, says, is they present Hamas, who says, we will never make peace with Israel. We do not accept Israel's right to exist. And our plan is to wipe Israel off the map. And we have forever to do it. If we don't do it now, our children will do it. If our children don't do it, our grandchildren will do it. If our grandchildren don't do it, our great-grandchildren will do it. Eventually, Israel will be wiped off the map. We will never negotiate with Israel, ever. We will never trade land for peace, ever. Our existence is death to the Jews. That's our policy, and we're not leaving from that. That's the New York Times last week. So I guess what I would say to you, and I don't have the answer, Cyril, but I think the question of what you do with that, and how Israel can reclaim the high moral ground. That's Daniel's phrase, reclaiming the moral ground. How do you claim the higher moral ground given that reality? I don't have the answer, but that's the question. And I think having conversations with our kids or with our friends or with people who are what Daniel calls troubled committed around those issues is essential work, But by the way, Cyril, before we leave you, what's your answer to that? I mean, if what the New York Times Daily says is true, which you know it is, that Hamas is sworn to destroy Israel, what should Israel do?
You know, and he raised that point, and I've often thought about it. Hamas has clearly said on more than one occasion that they would be amenable to a long-term truce. I don't expect peace, but the concept of a long-term truce has never, ever been pursued or explored. And maybe as a starting off point, that may be a reasonable approach to take. Whatever it is, Egypt is trying hard to do that. And perhaps if the new government ever materializes, and we'll only know that in a week, maybe that could be an alternative way, right, even recognizing Hamas will never accept our permanent presence.
Okay, so again, we're not going to resolve this. I did want, and then I'm going to call on Steve Bookbinder and Alice Bressman in that order. But what I want to say is, Tal Becker has, famously said that we're not going to solve Israel's problems here at Temple Emmanuel, but we can solve Temple Emmanuel's problems at Temple Emmanuel in terms of our disagreements about Israel, right? That's a famous Tal Becker line. At Kiddush, this coming Shabbos, there will be people, there will be food, there will be Kiddush, there will be life. We're not going to solve Israel and Hamas, but we can solve our ability to talk about Israel and Hamas with reasoned moral discourse, and I would celebrate that. Steve Bookbinder, and then Alice Bressman. And Steve, if you can,
yeah.
Thank you.
I'd just like to read something that I received from a friend on May the 11th, after Hamas had started bombing Jerusalem. To walk in Jerusalem is to imbibe not only its beauty, but also its many layers. Our Yom Yerushalayim is their day of protest. Our day of celebration is their day of mourning. That doesn't justify sending missiles to Jerusalem. Nothing justifies sending missiles to Jerusalem. But being here, especially now, captures the complexity of rejoicing in our story, while we also must recognize another people has its own story. Those words are from Wes. They were sent to all of us. I think that can become the core of education. I never got that education for 40 years until I started reading history. And that is an important part of history. Israel is threatened, but I lived through 67 and 73. And I must say I have a different perspective. We really worried then about whether Israel would survive. And it's profound. Today, Israel is a powerful and I think complex and troubled country in a lot of ways. So let me speak first on the tenure thing, because I think we always have to put things in perspective. My son-in-law sits on the tenure committee of the School of Engineering at Boston University. The dean who chairs that committee is a member of Temple Emmanuel. I am certain no one ever, and people come up for tenure all the time, that it was discussed whether someone had views on Israel. So I think we have to sort of look at what are questionable things, but to make blanket statements, we have to be careful. I also am deeply concerned by Danny Gordis's, by the way, I agree with pretty much what everything that Danielle had to say. But when Danny Gordis sort of says, well, somebody told me that the Israeli government has given up on support from American Jews, I'm deeply offended. Because, and we see the evangelicals as the base of support. And Danny has said this over and over again for the last 10 years. I know evangelicals. I grew up with evangelicals. They love Israel, but they don't like, quote unquote, New York or LA Jews who control the media and who they think are oppressing them. So I think we also have to be careful that we have so-called people like Danny sort of saying these things. So let me make it clear. I agree, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. I am a Zionist. I'm also a critic of certain things in Israel. I also want that history, the way that you told it, Wes, to be taught. And the way I look at it too is, when Danny Gordis says to me, they've given up on American conservative and reform Jews, he never says this about the Orthodox. I say in Hebrew, Ein li eretz acheret. I have no other land. I will continue to be involved with Israel on many levels till the day I die. And he can't tell me that he's given up on me, nor can Bibi Netanyahu, nor can Naftali Bennett or anybody else. I'm going to continue to go to Israel. I'm going to continue to support exactly what you said. Let's find a way to re-educate our children with its complexities, with its warts. Let's work one-on-one with people, and let's see what we can do. It is a long, hard fight. But the last 4 years of Bibi Netanyahu and people like Danny saying, oh, we gave up on you guys. He said it 5 years ago in our temple. You can't give up on me because I don't accept it. And that's where I think I agree with your basic 3 points. I think we got to be very careful with Rachel Fish. And tomorrow I'm calling Yale and I'm calling Brown, where I know the Israeli engagement officers. And I'm going to find out for myself how intense this really is on 2 campuses I know. So I'm committed to this. I'm committed to keeping it, and Ein li eretz acheret.
Okay. Well, thank you, Steve. I celebrate all of your instincts, and I always have. And what you have in common with, with I think Danielle and with a lot of the tenor of our conversation tonight, with Cyril Mazansky, his comment, Cyril's comment, Danielle's essay, is a reasonable moral critique. Is it not only is it appropriate, it's essential, and having that with our kids is essential. By the way, I've long believed that Ari Shavit did a huge favor to the Jewish people when he punctured the Disneyland myth that Israel was a land without a people for a people without a land, and that's what I was educated on. Israel is a land without a people for people without a land. And if that's what we give our kids, then when they go off to whatever college they go off to, they're not prepared for the complexities. We need to prepare our kids for moral complexity. I mean, Israel is a beautiful country and so morally justified, but it's also morally complex. And we have to be able to create kids who can handle that moral complexity. Alice Pressman, you are our next speaker.
I think it's so appropriate that the rabbi brought up the issues that our students are facing in campus, because when you look at the screen, look at the ages of the people listening. The college students are our future. And we happen to be having at Temple Emmanuel on June 10th, a Jewish college student activist who is going to speak to us at 8:00 at night on anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism on college campuses and social media. His name is Noam Bornstein, And he's also working for the Israeli American Council this summer on their activism team. He's on the front lines. He's going to share with us somewhat of a case study at UMass where he experienced anti-Semitism and what his reaction and fellow students, but it will be a broader discussion. So if you're concerned with this, I urge you to watch it because this is a kid on the front lines, and it would be good if he saw how many members of our temple are in support of him.
Alice, thank you. Thank you. I fully support that. I think it's wonderful. And I think Joanne Kay put in the chat room, that's great. And we need to supplement that with some ongoing education, and more about that later. Let me invite our next speaker, Jeremy Schmaman, to share some thoughts.
Thank you, Rabbi. I'm no politician, but my family lives in Israel, and we talk to them on a daily basis almost. My question for you is whether the approach you're taking isn't perhaps too soft and too late, and that the anti-Zionism that we're seeing as a marker of anti-Semitism is a blood libel. And it can be seen certainly among the younger people as a natural extension of the race-based ideology that's inherent in critical race theory and in intersectionalism. We are drinking the Kool-Aid ourselves in taking pity on Gaza. They have shopping malls we don't see. They don't show those in the news media. And they have buildings that are modern in some parts of Gaza. We're not showing those. We're not making the case strongly enough that all the funds that are flowing into Gaza are being used not to build hotels and hospitals and highways and airports, but they're building tunnels underground to attack Israel. To build on your point that Hamas has an agenda that is unshakable, and that when the IDF goes into battle, it sends leaflets to tell citizens to get out of the way, to minimize the loss. As you made so eloquently, what do they want to see in terms of the comparison of losses? More dead Jews, is that what would make them happy? I think that we are in a time of reevaluation of what we're seeing as even our own roles. I grew up as a liberal South African. My family left South Africa in large part because apartheid was anathema to us. And to hear the comparison now, when it's so lopsided, I wonder whether we shouldn't be much more vociferous, vigorous, outraged as a community in response to the blood libel about Israel doing all these things. And I wonder whether that isn't something that should be taken up at the organizational level of Jewish organizations throughout the country, a much more vociferous, vigorous, out there response. No one else is seeing our side.
Right.
Why are we bending over backwards to see everybody else's side? We don't want to kill anybody. We don't want to kill Palestinians, heaven forbid. But the story is deeper, and I think we're being too soft and too weak.
Okay, so Jeremy, I would love to tackle that for a second. Are we being too soft and too weak? Is it too little? Is it too late? So I want to respectfully disagree with you very strongly, because I think the problem in our world, look, we can't control the world. All we can control is, are we the moral people that we want to be? Are we the moral human beings that we want to be? When I look at the world, I see the problem of Kool-Aid. Too many people drink Kool-Aid and they lose their humanity in it. The people who drink the Trump Kool-Aid and think that he actually won and Biden lost, and therefore January 6th is the spirit of 1776, that is Kool-Aid that just distorts. I have no truck with that Kool-Aid. And so too, the people who drink the woke Kool-Aid on the left, who see everything in racial terms and everything in terms of oppression, and the woke Kool-Aid is as deleterious and inaccurate as the Trump Kool-Aid is. I'll tell you what I want to be passionate about. That I'm going to be personally passionate, and I'm going to do everything I can to make Temple Emmanuel passionate about the center, passionate about reason, passionate about moral, legitimate, reasonable, moral conversation. You're 100% right that there's a lot of blood libel. Ethnic cleansing is a blood libel. Genocide is a blood libel. War crimes is a blood libel. And apartheid is a blood libel, right? But that does not mean that there are not moral critiques to be had of Israel. And I think if you take the kind of vibe and tone and voice that you have, Jeremy, that's an inner conversation. That's like the Jewish right talking to the Jewish right. And that means that you're not being responsive to so much of the rest of the world. You're not hearing so much of the rest of the world, including our own children. You're not hearing so much of the world, including our own grandchildren. And you're not hearing so much of the world of what Daniel calls the troubled committed. People at Temple Emmanuel who dearly love Israel. I mean, Cyril Mazansky, who began with his, I mean, Cyril grew up in South Africa, as you know, loves Israel. The voice that you just articulated, Jeremy, doesn't respond to Cyril Mazansky. And if you can't respond to Cyril Mazansky on Israel, then it's too much inside baseball. So I think, and because Israel, one thing we could all agree on, however many voices there are, there's 141 participants, so there's 141 views. But here's one thing we can all agree on, 141 to 0. We can all agree on this. Israel is losing the PR war. No one would say otherwise. Wherever, if you're the leftist left peace now person or the rightist right, whatever that is, you would have to acknowledge that Israel is losing the PR war. And I think reasoned moral critique where you listen to legitimate points is helpful. I think if we take the position of, just the kind of voice that you have, we are only persuading those who are already persuaded, and we're giving up on the rest of the world. And I don't think Israel can do that. Ned Holstein, you're next.
Well, thank you, Wes. I first want to say very briefly the immense sense of gratitude I have to Temple Emmanuel and to you personally for what you have brought to my life. But I'm afraid to say that what I'm about to say may not sound that way and may not convey that deep sense of appreciation and gratitude that I do have. I would passionately dispute that what we need to do right now is strengthen the center. What we need to do, the center is in the wrong place. It's been failing us for 40 years. We need not to strengthen the center, but to move the center. It is the center that has allowed the proliferation of anti-Zionists and anti-Semites on the campuses, and the center has barely said boo about that. It is a center that has been silent about overt anti-Semitism on the campuses and elsewhere. The center has been silent about how our own Jewish kids are being educated to hate half the Jewish people on the face of the earth, those who are in Israel. The center has been silent about the nonsense that Israel represents colonial white suppression and white supremacy. None of that is true. What is true is we don't have to fight for the moral high ground. We already occupy the moral high ground. The moral low ground is occupied by the anti-Zionists. Israel is the only outpost in that part of the world of Enlightenment, Western, Judeo-Christian values. Yes, Israel makes mistakes. Yes, how can we blame a people? Are we so morally arrogant to believe that if we weren't under constant rocket attack and terrorist acts with knives and guns and cars, that we wouldn't at times overreact and commit actions that we would not be proud of? Are we so morally arrogant to believe that we are better morally than the Israelis? As a people, we already occupy the moral high ground. Imperfectly, but we do occupy it. And so what we need right now from the American Jewish leadership is unapologetic leadership that is not paralyzed by endless debates on minor violations or alleged violations by Israel. We need to act forcefully and with vigor, as Jeremy said. The people on the beaches of Omaha Beach, were not worried about who had the moral high ground. They were worried about survival. If we've learned anything in the past month or two, it's that this trend is about the survival of the Jewish people. This is not a game of tiddlywinks.
So Ned, I get the stakes.
Well, you didn't cover up anybody else, so let me finish, please. It's also a mistake to identify where the Jewish leadership needs to go with Trump. It has nothing to do with Trump. But twice we've heard that it has to do with Trump. It's nothing about Trump. It's about where we as Jews need to go. And we're not going there, and we haven't been going there for 40 years. In your eloquent description of the problem at the beginning of this session, it was very elegant. It was very articulate. But it's been going on for 30 or 40 years. There's nothing new about it. So when are we going to respond in the ways that we need to respond? We are being failed by our Jewish leadership. That's my point. Nothing is going to change until we have a determined and vigorous response, recognizing that we are human beings, we are prone to evil, we are prone to sin, but in this conflict, we are not the sinful party.
Okay, Ned. I certainly agree that in this conflict, we're not the sinful party, and I agree that the stakes are very high and that there is a very scary and unprecedented rising chorus that would argue that Israel itself is treif, right? That what's treif is not what Israel does, but that when you claim that Israel is apartheid, what you're saying is that the entire state is invalid morally, and that voice is has more currency and energy and momentum than it has ever had, including with a lot of Jews. And it was a lot of Jews in Cambridge who were citing BDS and supporting it. And what I'm saying to this call is that your voice, Ned, and Jeremy's voice is not going to change anybody's hearts or minds. And your voices are really good at getting people who already agree with you to say that a boy. It's really good at getting people who already agree with you to say that a boy. But it doesn't speak to people. It doesn't speak to people. It doesn't speak to Cyril Mazansky. It doesn't speak to Cyril Mazansky. It doesn't speak to Steve Bookbinder. It doesn't speak to our children, other than those who are at Jerry Falwell's university. It doesn't speak to legitimate questions of what Danielle called the troubled committed. And I don't think we have anything to hide. And I don't think we have anything we don't need to be afraid of an honest conversation. And I agree with Danielle. I sent you both pieces because I agreed with both pieces for what it's worth. I agree with Danielle that we need to try to reclaim the moral high ground by having honest moral dialogue one-on-one. And I also agree with Danny Gordis's piece, which is a very hard pill to swallow, that because so many Palestinians think the sin is 1948, and that's the official policy of Hamas, that we can try, but the pattern is we never get peace, and therefore we have to be able to think about what if there never is peace, the title of his article. And what he talks about is both safety and Jewish flourishing. And I think we need to talk about that too. So I think honest conversations instead of, I think honest conversations where we listen to each other, I believe, which I'm calling strengthening the center and education, to me is the move. By the way, we're a diverse community. So if you think it's not the move, by all means, in today's world, Ned, you're a leader as much as I am. You can pen an op-ed piece as much as I can. And people lead with informal authority. And you don't have to wait for timid, tepid Jewish institutional leaders. You can go out and say whatever you want to say, and everyone has a screen, and everyone has a mouse, and everyone can send click. So say what you want to say. I'm trying to hold a community together, and I'm trying to create moments of dialogue where we can hear each other. I want to just take a few last calls, and then I'm gonna wind up with a story and with an invitation for spiritual homework. It's June 1. So I want to give all 141 of you some homework. We have 3 last speakers. We have Marla Cheslowski, we have Larry Heimlich, and Bob Kahn, and then I'll close because I got Minion at 7:30. Marla.
Oh, hi, thank you. So Hamas is in this for the long run, for generations, and so are we. So my point is going to be on educating our children. I do think it is super important to secure the middle, and I think the polarization is not just Israel, it's the US politically, economically, religiously, socially. We're living in a world that's getting more and more polarized, us versus them on every dimension, and that's a problem. So I agree that the middle is super, super important. And as far as the history our kids are learning, the books that Steve read in school growing up and reads today are not the history books that are being taught in the schools. So what can we do? I'm going to say, let's look at what can we do at Temple Emmanuel? Let's look at our bar mitzvah program. I'm going to posit, it's going to sound a little crazy, that we have totally the wrong focus, not just Temple Emmanuel, but kind of the American Jewish view in general, that this is your day. That I think the bar mitzvah projects are very wrong on 2 dimensions. One is the emphasis is go out and save the world. Go out and save them. Don't worry about your own people. Go save them. Go help everybody else. We're sending the wrong message to our kids at a very, very young age, and it stays with them. It's a day we're celebrating of them. And the other dimension where I think it's totally wrong, what we're doing is it's all about you. Today's your day to shine. You get to be a star today. You get your name in the temple bulletin because you did this great project. I don't think a bar mitzvah is a day to have an individual achievement. I think a bar bat mitzvah is a day to become part of a community and to show that you are part of a community. And I think we're very close, but the message has morphed enough off to give our kids the wrong long-term focus. And if we want those future leaders and those future generations to go head to head with those future generations of Hamas, we need to be teaching them from the youngest ages that it's not about them as individuals and how they look on social media, that they look like they're doing something good. It's that they're actually doing something good to strengthen their own community. And I think that's something we can do at a very local level.
So Marla, let me just say nice, and it feels to me like you're positing a needless polarity in your so much thinking I feel suffers from what you just did, which is universal or particularism, and your critique that we're too universalistic and too much for other people and not enough about ourselves. Why is it an and, not an or? In the Torah, it's an and. We don't get to the Jewish story until Genesis 12. Genesis 1 through 11 is the human story. Genesis 12 is the Jewish story. Why can't we do both? And the language, the oxygen our kids breathe is concern about other people. That's a good thing. That's a really legitimate Jewish value. And particularism. By the way, we send our kids in the 9th grade to Israel. We send record numbers of kids to Israel off passport. We're always focused on Israel, 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 getting our kids to Israel. Record numbers of our kids go on birthright to Israel. So to me, it's an and, not an or, but you're certainly right. I think that there's no substitute for being in Israel to give our kids a sense of Israel. My only quibble with you is you can do both. I think Larry Heimlich, you're our next speaker. And just in the interest of time, it's 7:25 and I gotta be at Minion at 7:30. Larry, if you can be brief, and then Bob, if you can be brief, and then I will briefly close. Larry Heimlich.
Well, I sent out a message to everyone, and we've heard a lot of perspectives, but they're all most of them are what I describe as meta messages. In other words, they're world worldly, and maybe at worst case, some of them are exaggerations. But what is it that we do tomorrow? What is it that Temple Emmanuel can do that will perhaps make us be seen as a leader among Jewish organizations that are very concerned about this, and not just appear to be pushing the rock up against the hill?
Okay, good. So, Bob, I'm gonna take the liberty, just because I gotta get to, I want to answer that question. I'm gonna ask if you'll put your comment in the chat, because I want to close with some homework and answer Larry's call and try to wind this together. Here's what I would like to do. Here's your spiritual homework. I'm in the market for a book that is a 2021 version of Ari Shavit's My Promised Land. I don't yet know what that book is, but it's 7 years ago, the whole world we read, we spent a lot of weeks reading Ari Shavit's book. I think we need to refresh that kind of learning. So I'm going to try to find a title, and then over the summer, I'm going to hope that we can read that book together. My answer to your question, what should we be doing, is we should be educating ourselves. We should be doing fresh learning. We should be reading. We should be challenging. We should be learning. We should be growing. We should be stretching. We should be confronting our own assumptions. If you're right of Israel, you should be confronting your right of Israel assumptions. If you're left of Israel, you should be confronting your left of Israel assumptions. And we should be doing a much better job of trying to listen deeply, not to ethnic cleansing and genocide and apartheid. Those are blood libels. But people who have reasonable differences of opinion, we need to be able to listen to one another. So that is going to be your homework. When I get the book, I'm not yet sure what it is, but a book that will give Israeli history and put the last number of years in perspective. I think that is what we should do, is read that book, discuss it over the summer, talk about it, and then build relationships with people one-on-one. And I will get that book to you. Bob Kahn, we have 1 minute for your last comment.
My comment was, we shouldn't panic. We got to support the center. Over 80% of congressmen issued statements in support of Israel on Gaza in this last go around. We had a discussion of our board, and people were talking about their kids. By and large, our kids are on board with the Israel Project. We need to put the message out, join, and continue to work with the organizations you're involved with, AIPAC, AJC, whatever it is that you're interested in. I think what we should do is redouble our efforts with organizations that are putting out the message to the broader world.
Great. Thank you, Bob. So here's how I want to end. I'll just end with the following story, which is the one thing I remember from rabbinical school more than anything else. In 1995, in the wake of Oslo, some terrorists exploded bus number 18. And a rabbinical student named Matt Eisenfeld was killed on that, and his girlfriend Arlene Duker from Teaneck was on that bus. And Matt Eisenfeld was a great Talmud student, and his teacher was Isaac Frankel, who was a great Talmudist. Isaac Frankus was a great Talmudist. He was with his grandkids in Pittsburgh that weekend. He didn't know about it until he got out of his grandchild bubble. And he was reading the paper, and he saw about explosion bus 18, which we found out about on Sunday. He found out about it on the cab coming back to the seminary on Monday morning. And he found a group of grief-stricken students who lost their friend in a terrorist attack. And I'll never forget what he did. It's what I still remember from rabbinical school all these years later. He had us open up Ketubot chapter 8, and we learned Torah. What Jews do when the going gets tough is we learn Torah. We learn Torah. That's what we do. We're people of the book. So I want to learn relevant Torah. Ketubot was great, but I want to read about Israel and Israeli history, and then I want to talk about it with you. And I want us to be passionate about strengthening the center, being educated, and being a community of reasonable moral discourse. That's my position. Lots of love, guys. Take care. Thanks. Bye.